The gray silk was thin as a moth's wing, the only thing she owned that wasn't patched or stained with lye. It was a foolish garment for a blizzard, a ghost of a dress from a life that had never truly been hers, but it was all her husband had left her with when he'd shoved her out the door of their shanty. He had not even given her a coat. The words he had used were blades of ice, sharper than the wind that now tore at her, finding every seam in the delicate fabric. He had called her a curse, a bringer of bad fortune, his voice thick with cheap whiskey and the bitterness of a failed gold claim. Her name was May Lynn, and she was trudging through a world of white. The snow was up to her knees, a merciless, suffocating powder that stole the heat from her bones with every step. Her worn leather shoes were soaked through, her feet 2 blocks of aching ice. In her hand she clutched the handle of a small, battered suitcase that held everything she had in this new, cruel country. A change of clothes, a small tin of tea leaves she could not brew, and a thick wool shawl that was now a frozen board against her back. The mining camp was miles behind her, a foul memory of mud and greed. Ahead of her was only the endless snow-draped forest of the Montana Territory. She did not know the year, only that it was winter, a winter that intended to kill her. She had been walking since dawn, following the faint impression of a trail that had long since disappeared. Now, as the light began to fail, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple, a flicker of yellow caught her eye. It was distant, impossibly small, a single spark of warmth in the vast, freezing emptiness. A light. A cabin. Hope was a dangerous thing, a fire that could burn you out from the inside, but it was all she had left. It drove her forward, step after agonizing step. The wind howled a lament through the pines, and the cold was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. By the time she reached the small clearing, she was stumbling, her vision blurring at the edges. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney breathing a steady plume of smoke into the darkening sky. There was no welcome here, just the stark reality of survival. A stack of firewood stood against one wall, nearly as tall as she was. An axe was buried in a chopping block. She collapsed against the solid wood of the door, her lungs burning. For a long moment she could not raise her hand. She thought of all the doors that had been closed to her, the door of her home village, which she could never re-enter, the door of the agent's office in San Francisco with his dismissive eyes, the door of the church in the mining camp where the preacher had looked right through her, and finally the door of her husband's shanty slammed shut on her back. Why should this one be any different? But the alternative was to lie down in the snow and let the white silence take her. With the last of her strength, she raised a numb fist and knocked. The sound was feeble, swallowed by the wind. She knocked again, harder, the impact jarring her frozen knuckles. Silence. Then, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from inside. The door creaked open a few inches. A man stood in the opening, a figure made of shadows against the firelight behind him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed carved from the same hard timber as his cabin. A dark scar cut a line from his temple down his cheek, disappearing into a thick, untrimmed beard. His eyes, deep-set and unreadable, took in her shivering frame, the foolish gray dress, the desperation clinging to her like frost. A long-barreled pistol rested easy in a holster at his hip. He was a gunslinger. She knew the type. Men who lived by a cold code, who trusted no one. She tried to speak, to beg for shelter, for a spot on the floor, for anything, but the words froze in her throat. A wave of dizziness washed over her and her legs gave way. She slumped against the doorframe, her suitcase falling from her grasp into the snow. This was it then, the final rejection. She closed her eyes, waiting for the door to slam shut, for the cold to have its final victory. Instead, a low voice, rough as scraped leather but steady, cut through the wind. "Come sit by the fire." He moved with a surprising lack of hurry, stepping out onto the small porch and easily lifting her into his arms. She was so light she felt like a bundle of sticks. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the storm, and the sudden warmth was a shock, a pain almost as sharp as the cold. He deposited her gently in a sturdy wooden chair near the hearth, the heat from the blazing fire washing over her, making her skin prickle and ache. He retrieved her suitcase from the snow, setting it carefully by the door before stoking the fire with a poker. He did all this without another word, his movements deliberate and economical. Maylin could only watch, huddled in the chair, a tremor running through her body that she could not control. The cabin was one room, clean and spare. A bed was built into one corner, with a thick bear pelt for a blanket. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves on the wall held tins of food, books, and neatly stacked ammunition boxes. There was a sense of order here, of a life stripped down to its essentials. The man moved to a small stove, pouring steaming water from a kettle into a tin mug. He brought it to her. "Drink this," he said. It wasn't a request. Her hands were too stiff to hold the mug. He seemed to understand. He knelt before her, holding the mug to her lips so she could take small, careful sips. It was just hot water, but it felt like life itself, a thawing that started in her chest and spread slowly outward. When she was done, he took the mug and turned his attention to her feet. He pulled off her ruined shoes and the thin stockings, his touch impersonal but not unkind as he examined her frostbitten toes. He grunted, a low sound of disapproval, and went to a small chest, returning with a jar of greasy-smelling salve and clean strips of lemon. He worked in silence, gently rubbing the salve into her numb skin, then wrapping each foot with a practiced efficiency. "The name's Jedediah," he said, not looking up from his task. "Folks call me Jed." "Maylin," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He nodded, finishing the bindings. He rose and pulled the bearskin from his bed, draping it over her shoulders. The weight was immense, a comforting animal warmth that finally began to still her shivering. He saw her looking at the bed. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll take the floor." She opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off with a look. It wasn't a harsh look, but it was final. He took a blanket from the chest for himself, then sat in the other chair, picking up a piece of leather and a long needle, and began to methodically repair a piece of tack. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind outside, and the steady pull of the needle through leather. He asked no questions. He did not ask where she came from, or why a woman in a silk dress was wandering his mountain in a blizzard. His silence was a gift, a space for her to simply breathe, to let the warmth seep into her marrow and push back the cold that had nearly claimed her. For the first time in a very long time, she was not being judged, or used, or discarded. She was simply being allowed to exist. Curled under the heavy pelt, watching the firelight dance on the quiet man's face, Maylin fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next few days passed in that same quiet rhythm. The storm raged outside, burying the cabin in a deep blanket of white. Jed moved about his small home with a familiar ease, his routines as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun, which was visible only as a slight brightening of the gray sky. He would rise before dawn, make coffee, and go out to check his snares, returning with a rabbit or two for their meals. He would chop wood, clean his rifle with meticulous care, and read from one of his worn books in the evening. Maylin, her strength slowly returning, took over the cooking. She found his stores were simple: flour, salt, beans, dried meat, and coffee. Using what she had, she made him stews that were richer than he was used to, and bread that was softer. She mended his shirts, her stitches small and neat. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks and mutual respect began to form between them. She learned that the scar on his face would pale when he was tired, and that he had a habit of staring into the fire as if searching for something in the flames. He learned that she moved with a quiet grace, that her hands, though calloused from her life in the camp, were deft and gentle, and that she hummed a soft, sad tune when she thought he wasn't listening. He never asked about her husband, and she never offered the story. The gray silk dress, which she had washed and repaired, hung from a peg on the wall, a silent testament to the life she had escaped. She was safe here, in this pocket of stillness, but she knew it was temporary. The world, and the men in it, would not forget her so easily. On the 5th day, the storm broke. The sun shone with a blinding intensity on the fresh snow. The silence was broken by the sound of horses. Jed was outside splitting logs when he heard them. He stopped, his body going still, his hand resting on the handle of the axe. Maylin, who had been sweeping the floor, looked out the small window. 2 riders were making their way up the path to the cabin. Her heart seized. She recognized them immediately. One was her husband Barlow, his face puffy and red. The other was his business partner, Marcus Thorne, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Stay inside," Jed said, his voice low and flat. He did not turn to look at her, but she knew the command was absolute. He left the axe in the block and walked calmly to the front of the cabin, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his posture relaxed but ready. Barlow slid from his horse, stumbling in the deep snow. "There you are, you witch," he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at the cabin. "I knew you'd run to some other man. Get her out here, mister. She's my property." Thorne dismounted with more grace, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, the woodpile, and Jed. He was assessing, weighing, and measuring. He smiled his thin smile. "My partner is emotional," he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. "But he has a point. Under territorial law, the woman belongs to him. We'll just be taking her and be on our way. No need for any trouble." Jed stood his ground on the porch, his expression unreadable. "The way I hear it," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still, cold air, "he threw her out. In a blizzard. That sounds a lot like abandonment. Voids any claim a man might have." Thorne's eyebrows lifted in surprise. He hadn't expected a mountain recluse to be quoting territorial statutes. "You a lawyer?" "I read," Jed said simply. Barlow, fueled by whiskey and rage, was not interested in legal debate. He pulled a pistol from his coat, the barrel wavering unsteadily. "I don't care about the law. She's mine." He lunged toward the porch. Maylin watched, her hands pressed against the cold glass of the window, her breath catching in her throat. Jed didn't draw his weapon. He moved with a startling, fluid speed. As Barlow stumbled up the single step, Jed's hand shot out, not for his gun, but for Barlow's wrist. He twisted, a sharp, brutal motion that sent the pistol flying into a snowbank. With his other hand, he shoved Barlow's chest. Her husband, who had seemed so large and menacing in their tiny shanty, went down with a surprised grunt, landing hard on his back in the snow. The entire exchange took less than 2 seconds. Jed stood over him, looking not at Barlow, but at Thorne. "Your partner is trespassing," he said, his voice still level, "and he's drunk. I suggest you take him and go." Thorne didn't move for a long moment. He looked at the ease with which Jed had disarmed Barlow. He looked at the pistol resting in Jed's holster, and at the calm, dangerous certainty in the man's eyes. He was no fool. This was not some simple trapper. but he was also not a man who backed down easily. His gaze shifted from Jed to the cabin window, where he saw Maylin's face for a brief second before she pulled back. That thin, predatory smile returned. He bent and hauled Barlow to his feet. "You've made a powerful enemy, friend," Thorne said to Jed, his tone conversational. Then he turned his head slightly, his voice dropping so it was meant just for the cabin, just for her. "And you," he called out, "you know things about Barlow's claim. Things I might find useful. A woman alone in this territory? She needs friends." The threat was unmistakable. He wasn't just after a runaway wife. He was after something she knew. He shoved Barlow toward his horse and mounted his own. As they rode away, Thorne looked back one last time, his cold eyes lingering on the cabin door. Maylin knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was far from over. Thorne would be back. That night, the easy silence in the cabin was replaced by a taut, unspoken tension. The confrontation had shattered their fragile peace. Jed was cleaning his pistol at the table, his movements precise and methodical, but his jaw was set in a hard line. Maylin sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The threat from Thorne had not been idle. She understood now that she had brought more than just herself to this man's door. She had brought danger. "He will come back," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Jed nodded, not looking up. "He will." He finished with the pistol, sliding the cylinder back into place with a soft click. "What does he think you know?" She took a deep breath. The time for secrets was over. She rose and went to her small suitcase by the door. She knelt and opened it. Inside, beneath her spare clothes, was a small, leather-bound ledger. She brought it to the table and laid it before him. "My husband, Barlow, he cannot read or write much," she explained. "He had me keep the books for his partnership with Thorne." She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with her neat, precise script, columns of dates, expenses for blasting powder and timber, and notes on geological formations, and, most importantly, detailed records of their test digs and findings. "They had a third partner at the start," she continued, her finger tracing a line of faded ink. "A man named Peterson. He found the main vein. A week later, Barlow told me he had left, sold his share cheap to Thorne." She looked up at Jed. "But the entries, they do not make sense. The day Peterson supposedly left, Thorne bought a new shovel and 2 extra boxes of cartridges. An odd purchase for a man who just acquired a bigger share of a promising claim." Jed's hands, which had been resting on the table, clenched into fists. His face was grim, the scar standing out pale against his skin. "What was Peterson's first name?" he asked, his voice strained. "I do not know. Barlow just called him Peterson." Jed stared at the ledger for a long time. Then he pushed his chair back and walked to a heavy locked chest in the corner of the room. He unlocked it with a key he wore on a leather thong around his neck. He reached inside and pulled out a worn, folded document and a tarnished silver star. He brought them back to the table. He unfolded the paper. It was a warrant issued by the United States Marshal Service. The name on it was Jedediah Stone. The star was his badge. "Peterson's first name was Daniel," Jed said, his voice raw with a grief he had clearly carried for a long time. "He wasn't a miner. He was my partner. We were tracking Thorne. We knew he was behind a string of claim jumpings up from the Dakotas, but we could never prove it. He was always one step ahead, leaving other men to take the fall. Dan went undercover, posing as a prospector, and got in with him and Barlow." He looked at Maylin, his eyes filled with a cold fire. "The last telegraph I got from Dan said he'd found his proof. The next day, the sheriff in the nearest camp wired that he'd been killed in a cave-in. An accident. I never believed it. He tapped the ledger with his finger. This is the proof. This shows Thorne was active at the claim, buying supplies, on the day he was supposed to be 100 miles away. This puts the lie to his alibi. The pieces clicked into place for Mei Lin, forming a terrible picture. Thorne hadn't bought Peterson's share. He had murdered him and buried him somewhere on that mountain, taking his discovery for his own, and she, unknowingly, had recorded the evidence. The ledger in her hands wasn't just a book of numbers. It was a testament to a crime. It was the reason Thorne wanted her back, or silenced. A heavy silence fell over the room. The fire crackled, oblivious to the weight of their discovery. Jed finally looked at her, his expression softening with a weariness that went bone deep. "He knows you have this," Jed said. "He won't stop until he gets it. You are not safe here. You are not safe anywhere in this territory." He ran a hand over his face. "I can get you to Benton. There's a telegraph office there. You can wire your family or the agent in San Francisco. I have enough money to see you on a train heading east. You can disappear. Start a new life." It was the safe choice, the sensible choice. He was offering her an escape, a way out of the danger she had stumbled into. She could take it, leave this all behind. She could be anonymous again, a ghost in a different city. But she looked at the exhaustion in his eyes, at the Marshall star lying on the table next to her ledger. She thought of his quiet kindness, of the way he had wrapped her frozen feet and given her his bed. He had been hunting his partner's killer alone for months. Now she held the key. To run would be to abandon him, to let Thorne win, to be the frightened, helpless woman Barlow had always told her she was. She pushed the ledger back across the table toward him. "I will not run again," she said, her voice steady. The decision settled inside her, solid and sure. "This man, Thorne, he killed your friend. He would have left me to die in the snow. Justice must be done." She met his gaze, and for the first time she did not feel like a victim. She felt like a witness. "What is our plan?" A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through Jed's eyes. He picked up his star and pinned it to the inside of his coat. "All right," he said, a new resolve in his voice. "Here's what we do." 6 months later, spring had laid its claim to the mountains. The deep snows had retreated, leaving behind the carpet of new green and the bright, defiant colors of wildflowers. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The cabin no longer looked like a lonely outpost against the wilderness. A small, neatly tilled garden grew beside it, rows of hopeful shoots reaching for the sun. Mei Lin knelt in the dark soil, her hands dirty, carefully tending to the young plants. The gray silk dress was packed away in her suitcase at the bottom of the chest. She now wore a simple, practical dress of blue cotton. She had made it herself from cloth Jed had bought on a supply run. The plan they had made that winter night had worked. Jed had sent a message with a passing freighter, a carefully worded note from her, offering to sell Barlow's ledger to Marcus Thorne. The meeting was set for the abandoned assayer's office in a half-dead mining town a day's ride away. Thorne, arrogant and greedy, had walked right into the trap. He had come expecting a frightened woman he could easily intimidate. Instead, he found Jedediah Stone, with a Marshall star on his chest and a warrant in his hand. The confrontation had been brutally simple. Thorne had gone for his gun, but Jed was faster. He had not killed him. He had wanted justice, not vengeance. Thorne was taken to the territorial capital, tried before a circuit judge, and with the damning, undeniable evidence of Mei Lin's ledger, he was convicted of the murder of Deputy Marshal Daniel Peterson. He had been hanged 2 months ago. Barlow, implicated and terrified, had vanished, likely fleeing to another territory to lose himself. Jed had used the reward money to file a proper homestead claim on the land. The cabin, the clearing, the stream that ran nearby, it was all legally his. Theirs. He came out of the cabin now, walking over to the garden. He had filled out, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a quiet contentment. He stood beside her for a moment, watching her work. He held out his hand. In his palm was a small paper packet. "For the garden," he said. "Carrots." She smiled, a real, unburdened smile, and took the packet. Their fingers brushed, a brief, warm touch that sent a pleasant shock through her. She had found that he was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language she had come to understand perfectly. He had built an extension onto the cabin, a second room that served as a proper kitchen and pantry. He had bought 2 milking goats, whose bleating now provided a constant, cheerful background noise. He was building a life, not just for himself, but for her. He looked out at the mountains, green and alive under the spring sun, then back at her. "Figured this place could use more life," he said, his voice a low rumble. Maylin looked at the rich earth on her hands, at the sturdy cabin, at the steady man beside her. They had both been driven to this mountain by cruelty and loss, seeking refuge from a world that had cast them out. But in the long winter silence, they had discovered that true shelter wasn't a place you found. It was a thing you built, together, one day at a time. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.